morning, good evening, good afternoon. I've said on this platform that Zimbabwe is a failed state, and I'll say it again. Zimbabwe is a failed state. It is a fact. It is stating the obvious. What is so disappointing about Zimbabwe is that the reason why we are a failed state and the answers, the solutions to us getting out of this mess are already there. If we only open our eyes. Because the reality is the problems we are facing, why we are a failed state, are not new. Many other nations have gone down the same route and met the same disastrous consequences. And some of them, they failed to recover, but others have managed to rise from the ashes of their failure. We could do the same. Here is a book, Why Nations Fail. That is the 2024 Nobel Prize for Economics. I think the book covers every possible angle of all the many multitudes of problems that Zimbabwe has faced and is facing, and why we are a failed state. If we read through the book and applied it faithfully, Zimbabwe will be a totally different country. The Japanese scholar Ken Yamamoto, who visited Zimbabwe in the 80s, soon after independence, remarked that the country had the potential to become the South Korea of Africa. He was right. We had the potential. But right now, after 44 years of independence, I think there's no denying that we've become the North Korea of Africa, a failed state in which millions of people have been condemned to live in abject poverty. Here is the BBC interviewing the individuals, the three individuals who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and explaining what the book is all about.
This year's prize in economics touches on historical injustices and cruelties, as well as current events too. The question of how economic development is connected to individual rights, equality, and decent political leaders. When large parts of the world were colonized by European powers, their approaches varied. Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson have shown that prosperity rose in places where the colonial authorities built functioning social institutions rather than simply exploiting the locals and their resources. But no growth or improvements in lifestyle were created in societies where democracy and legal certainties were lacking. The laureate's research also helps us understand why this is the case and could contribute to reducing income gaps between nations. So, Daron, when you're both talking about the importance of democratic institutions, what kind of institutions are you talking about?
The label that we, Simon, Jim, and I use is inclusive institutions, meaning institutions that distribute political power and economic power and opportunity broadly in society. And that requires certain political institutions that provide voice to people so that they can participate, their views are expressed, and also constraints on the exercise of that power.
So you're just talking about really the checks and balances we see in, set down in constitutions like an independent legislature, a free judiciary, freedom of speech with, the media being able to operate as it wishes.
Absolutely, but that's not enough, partly because what you write in a constitution is not going to get enforced unless there is a general empowerment of the people. So constitutions are sometimes changed just like shirts. And it doesn't mean anything unless it becomes enforced.
But you have also seen countries prosper economically, which have been governed by fairly authoritarian governments, haven't you? I mean, often we talk about Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore or Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's not the general pattern. I mean, so there are examples like that, of course, but for every example like that, there's far more examples of autocratic societies that have not flourished economically. If you can create inclusive economic institutions, even under a politically kind of autocratic society, you can flourish economically, at least transitarily. That's what happened in China, starting in the late 1970s. It was the movement towards a much more inclusive economy, giving people the right to make decisions, making them residual claimants on their own efforts. And, so that's what generated economic growth. But our view is that, you can't sustain an economy like that under an autocratic political system. It can be there for a transitory period, but it's not sustainable.
A lot of your research is based on countries which have been colonized. And there's been a lot of debate, of course, particularly in the United Kingdom because of their historical, Great British Empire, and whether it was good or bad for the countries that were colonized, practically all of Africa. But you say that colonization often brought about a reversal in economic fortunes of the colonized people. So just unpack for us why you say that, because it sounds like you're saying colonization was bad for the people.
I think colonization was a disaster, absolutely. But of course, it did create prosperous societies in parts of the world, in North America and Australasia. But for the indigenous people, it was a catastrophe. Diseases wiped out 90% of the population of the Americas. People were exploited. They had their lands and livelihoods destroyed, their communities destroyed. I mean, absolutely, yes. So I don't, I don't think there's much debate about that in my view. I think this notion of reversal, in the Americas, it's very clear in the Americas. At the time, you go back 500 years, where were the prosperous parts of the Americas? Central America, the Central Valley of Mexico, Andean, the Inca Empire, the Mexicas, the Valley of Oaxaca. There you had writing, you had political complexity, you had economic organization, sophistication, and whatever. The southern cone of Latin America and North America far behind. And then this gets completely reversed during the colonial period. And the places that were relatively poor then become relatively prosperous. So there you see the reversal in a very clear way.
Right. I want to bring you in, Demis, because your mother is Singaporean or Singaporean born. You were brought up in Britain, of course. But what do you think when you hear about this kind of thing about democracy and prosperity?
Well, it's very interesting. Obviously, I've heard from my mother the sort of economic miracle that Lee Kuan Yew brought to Singapore, and he's rightly revered for that. I don't know. Obviously, this is not my area, but how do you try and how are these institutions going to be built in the places where they aren't? Is it going to be external encouragement, or it has to happen internally, or how is that going to evolve? Or you just have to be lucky with finding the right leader, like a Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the success stories they all come from within. People build the institutions in their own context. I mean, there are, I think Lee Kuan Yew is a sort of fascinating person. He's not the only person in the world like that. You had Seretse Khama in Botswana. You have other kind of outstanding leaders. But I think on average, the evidence suggests autocratic regimes don't do as well as democratic ones. And sure, people matter, individuals matter, having good leader matter. Where do you find Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So then, if it has to come from within, so you're pointing out with your great work like what the issues are, but how other than wait for the right Mandela or Lee Kuan Yew to come along, which is very rare, as you say, what else can be done to encourage those institutions to be built?
Yeah, but there's lots of institutions that are built without famous leaders.
I think the track record of external imposition of institutions is not very good. There are a few cases where you can point to, but generally, institutions are built organically. But there are influences out there. So one of the cases Jim already hinted at, Seretse Khama, Botswana, an amazingly successful democracy in sub-Saharan Africa, an amazingly successful country in terms of economic growth, very rapid growth on the whole. And it was all existing actually pre-colonial institutions that were the basis of more democratic, but leadership there mattered too. So you need the combination. So I think facilitating institution building domestically, providing tools for them and getting rid of our hindrances, often, Western and Russian powers or sometimes Chinese powers interfering in other countries' domestic affairs is not conducive to better institution building. But at the end of the day, institutions are going to be built bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it at that point. We need democratic institutions, functional democratic institutions that have got to be built from the bottom up. More so when you're looking at a country like Zimbabwe, where we have failed to produce such institutions. We cannot deny that countries like Botswana are doing well because they are politically stable. People have got a meaningful say in the governance of the country. There is law and order. The biggest legacy, in my view, that Nelson Mandela left the people of South Africa is that he left that nation with healthy and functioning democratic institutions, notably parliament, the press, the police, the judiciary, etc. All these other leaders, Beke, Jacob Zuma, and so forth, who have come after Mandela. I think if the institutions had not been strong, South Africa would be another failed state like Zimbabwe. So where are we? Well, we are a failed state. We can learn from the mistakes of the last 44 years and stop repeating the same mistake over and over again. That's my argument. The solutions are there. We can learn from history, human history. It is shocking that 44 years after independence, we are failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Free, fair, and credible elections. In 44 years after independence, and 2,500 years of human history since the ancient Greeks gave mankind democracy as a solution to how nations should be governed. We are still struggling. Solutions are there. We just don't want to learn. And history also tells us that those who do not learn from the past are destined to repeat the same mistake over and over again. When are we going to learn? If there is a book that you must read in 2025, I believe it is this book, Why Nations Fail. It will open your eyes. And I believe every institution in Zimbabwe should have this book in its library. All those going to high school and above should read this book. If it contains the solutions to why we are a failed state, then it should be compulsory that we read it and understand it. We cannot say we didn't know the answers. We have the answers. Here is the answers to why Zimbabwe is a failed state. The question is, are we finally prepared to open our eyes and accept those answers? One of the areas we have failed ourselves is to hold free, fair, and credible elections. After 44 years of independence, we still cannot hold free, fair, and credible elections. Because, frankly, the majority out there have no clue what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. If you do not have a clue what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections, then per se you do not deserve democracy and good governance. It is often said that nations get the government they deserve. My fellow Zimbabweans, we deserve this corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical ZANU-PF dictatorship, complete with his entourage of equally corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless MDC, CCC opposition leaders. We are not getting out of this mess until we learn. Here is a book from which we can learn and finally get out of this mess. Think about it. Thank you very much. Have a good night.